close to 3 years now. 30 some odd venues, 4 exhibits, another one in the making, which I'll discuss briefly later. But a little bit about Sherwood, career foreign service officer. His 3-year anniversary of his death was this last Monday. So keep him in your thoughts and prayers. His wife, his widow, attended the event last night at the Historical Society. She came to visit us, so that was nice to have her join us. Sherwood was a former president of the Basler Library Board. He loved the library. He still does in many ways. He's here with us in spirit. And today, to honor him and also the honor of the library that he dearly loved, we are going to make and on behalf of Sherwood and the War, Peace, and Justice Project, a presentation by author historian Jeffrey Finegan, the author of the I Knew George Washington series of books. And we're going to present a copy of the 4 books that Jeffrey has authored. One in particular today is Colonel Washington and Me, which we'll be giving away to somebody sitting here in this room. But we like to present them to the Basler Library. This is the holdings of our future in regard to our democracy, knowledge, wisdom, and you all here because you probably love the library as much as I do. So with that, I would like to ask author and historian Jeffrey Finegan, Molly Shane from the library staff, and the board to come up, please. So this is very informal because I'm in charge up here, so I can't do any better, so sorry. But so all I can say is these are wonderful books, and they may have been written, I don't want to say this because Jeffrey's going to probably throw them at me, but some would say that they're written for a juvenile audience. I've read them, they're wonderful. And you have grandchildren or children yourself, they're wonderful books to steep you in the history and who George Washington really was. And that will come out today during this wonderful discussion, engagement between slave valet William Lee and George Washington, moderated, of course, by Jeffrey Finegan. So with that, again, Molly, thank you for all you do. Thank you for hosting us today. And of course, Jeffrey, thank you for bringing the history back to Carlisle. So thank you very much. So we hope you we know we found a good home for the books. We just hope we can get people to read them because they're special books. Thank you, Molly. Okay, so it's time. You didn't come here to hear me, so very quickly, I'm Scott Buren, one of 3 project coordinators for the War, Peace, and Justice Project. I'm joined here by Lorenda Twigg, another member of our planning committee. The purpose of the War, Peace, and Justice Project, for those of you, I see a lot of familiar faces, so many of you have been here at previous events, but for those that have not been here before, the purpose of the project is to illuminate the drama of human conflict and war's impact on society. It's not just our veterans and their families, but also indigenous populations. And of course, what we see in the world today, the misery and suffering, the sacrifices made by those in the Middle East, in Ukraine, Russia, Sudan, Haiti, the list is long. The conflicts are, unfortunately, are changing, but perhaps not for the better. But we also address community interests as well. And so this event is also co-sponsored by the Carlisle Bridge Builders. And they presented last night, they're not here today, but if you'd like at the end, if you would just, if you could visit the table in the back, it's a wonderful organization that is attempting to build bridges between organizations and people in our community. And I don't have to tell you, Carlisle is a special community. For a military man for 30 years, and I know there's several other military veterans in here who've traveled all over the United States, different postings, internationally. We came to Carlisle and we stayed here for a reason. It's a special place. And we're going to experience a very special venue today. I have to thank, or I'd be remiss, in our partners, Dickinson College, Penn State Dickinson Law School, Cumberland County Historical Society, the Carlisle Chamber of Commerce, the Association of the U.S. Army, which is the Army's professional organization, the Joint Civil Military Interaction Network in Georgia, and participating organizations, the U.S. Army War College and the Peacekeeping Institute, also resident at Carlisle Barracks. And last but not least, our sponsor, our sole sponsor, and a very generous sponsor who was able to offer funding to us so we can offer free events like this to the public. And that is the Cort Christie Institute, which I am also a board member of. So again, I would be remiss if I didn't thank them. And of course, the library for hosting this event. I think I've said my piece. I do have one save round, so excuse me. So this is our last event for November. However, we're bringing a significant art exhibit to the Cumberland County Historical Society. It will be installed on or about the first week of December, and it's a Quaker art. It's about peace, nonviolence, by Quaker artist Todd Drake from New York City. He's nationally and internationally renowned, not just for his artwork, but also for his photography. And so it will be augmented by history of the Quaker faith, William Penn, George Fox, etc. So that will be installed on or about the first or second week of December, and it should run through up until the beginning of March. So there'll be more to follow on that. And with that, we need to proceed here because we have some wonderful guests, historic guests, and it's not the first time George Washington has been here. It's here a long, long time ago, but back again. We're thrilled to have him in Slave Valley, William Lee. But I'd like to introduce at this time author, historian Jeffrey Finegan, again, the author of the I Knew George Washington series of books. And since he can't pander his books, I can, because he's professional, and I'm not so professional, but books are for sale. At the end, if you'd like to purchase a book, Jeffrey would be more than happy to accept your monies for that, but also sign your book. But you can also purchase them at the Cumberland County Historical Society gift store and museum shop. So they're for sale. And we also will have a winner before you all leave tonight of one of his books. So Jeffrey, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, sir. It is a pleasure to be here in front of everyone. Some repeat guests from last night. And thank you, Scott, and your sidekick, Lorenda, for getting the room set up and having us here today. What a great little place. Great event last night as well. And I am more than honored to have the two reenactors, George Washington, Daniel Cross, and Joseph Feaster as Billy Lee, William Lee. They both reenact these two historic figures at Colonial Williamsburg. Pretty important place. They are not representing Williamsburg today. They're here as individuals, so we had to give you that little disclaimer. But it's a great honor for me to see these two gentlemen kind of breathe life into this book that I brought to life. Virtually every important biography on Washington talks about his lifelong relationship with slavery. Washington inherits his first slaves when he's at the ripe old age of 11, and doesn't legally take control of these people until he's 18 years old. But at age 11, he's handed 10 human beings as part of his father's estate. It's a compelling and yet very complex story at the same time, with the fight for freedom and all the while own other human beings. So it was about the time that Barack Obama was running for president for the first time, and there was a lot of talk about race. Some years later, there's still a lot of talk about race. That I decided that this relationship that Washington had, and he had a relationship with so many other powerful people during his days as a colonel during the French and Indian War, all 8 years of the American Revolution, and then 8 years as the President of the United States, that this relationship that he had with a man that he owned just kept kind of ringing back in my mind. And laying in bed one morning, I told my wife that I was gonna write a book about George Washington, and she said, "Oh, for the person that didn't read a book until he was a senior in college." True story, but that's a story for another day. So, as Scott had mentioned, the book was intended for younger readers. As I spoke with the gentleman in the front row here earlier, intended for younger readers as a kind of a flashpoint. I want to learn more about Washington. I want to know more about the foundation of the United States of America, but in particular, I want to know more about slavery here in North America, or around the world for that matter. The book was edited, all 4 of my books have been edited at Mount Vernon by the research historian there. You can see Mary's name on the 2 screens. As a self-published author, Barnes & Noble was going to do my first book. There was some problems, and we decided to do it alone. And to have Mary edit my books was kind of the validation from the historic perspective. So they are historic fiction. We breathe life into 4 separate individuals that tell us about life with Washington. Interestingly, these 4 people all knew each other very well. So they're standalone stories. You don't need to read one to understand the second one. But they come at us from different perspectives in their relationship with Washington. As I often said about, I have a mother that's of Italian extraction, and my older brother, her firstborn, is always going to be her favorite. It's just part of the culture. He gets it, I get it, everything's fine, but we recognize it. So Colonel Washington and Me is my first book, and like my mother's relationship with my older brother, it's always going to be my favorite. It is, again, that incredibly complex story of these 2 individuals in Washington. As Lafayette would refer to him as a patriarch of liberty, all the while owning 124 human beings. At least that's the number that we know of at the time of his death. So in a moment, and I just wanted to, we did this a little bit different last night. Our 2 reenactors began the story, then we give a little context at the end. We just thought we'd flip that script a little bit, give you some context here today. The 2 gentlemen that are reenactors are going to begin as Washington and Billy Lee have arrived home after the Revolutionary War, an 8-year period. They only visit Mount Vernon for 2 very short occasions, on the way to Yorktown, on the way back from Yorktown in 1781. But essentially 8 years away from family and the estate, the home, Mount Vernon, that was home to both men that they loved dearly. So they're just arriving home at the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. They quite literally return home on Christmas Eve of 1783, shortly, just a couple of days after Washington has resigned his commission in front of Congress in Annapolis, Maryland. So the gentlemen are going to pick it up from there, and I'd like to invite them in now. Colonel Washington, in this case, General Washington, and his faithful enslaved valet, William Lee.
Yes, sir. They've been laid down, fresh hay. I believe the ride was much longer for them than for us.
It's a bit strange to do it at home for the first time
Indeed,
in
sir.
literally, what, 8 years now?
8 years, sir. 8 long years.
Very long years. But not a bad thing, I would say, in the wrong process. How was it, how did you feel riding up to the house after so long?
General, I must say, seeing the candle lit in the house and seeing the billowing smoke coming from the chimney, it's good to be home, sir. Truly, it is good to be home.
I feel the same. I did not expect the joy to hit me quite as much as I felt it, but it's a good thing. It's strange to be gone for so very long, and then to suddenly arrive and see everyone again, my wife, the grandchildren, the various people of the house. Have you been able to see Frank yet?
I have not, sir.
It's a shame.
But I hear he's doing well. Last time I heard, sir, well, yet again, I'm an uncle. A new baby girl.
A new baby girl.
sir.
How many months ago? Is it
Oh,
very
sir.
recent or?
Very recent, sir, only about 3 months ago.
3 months. Ah, that's joyful. Very, very good. Well, I suppose you would like to go and take some time to see her.
If I may, General.
After this evening with Mr. Finegan, I have no business that needs your attention, so you can have the night to yourself if you'd like it.
Very good, sir. Thank you.
Speaking of which, we should probably prepare for the gentleman since he will be
Yes.
along shortly, and I'd rather have the road off me as opposed to on me when I speak with him. Thank you. I have a question for you.
Sir?
When we were putting the bit of business together at Congress, did you notice any of their particular attitudes as the resignation of my military commission was put forward at Annapolis?
Sir, if you would have saw those gentlemen, I swear.
What do they look like?
At first, sir, there was some, I must admit, consternation. There was some fear. They thought that mayhaps you would take your personal army and take over Congress and make yourself king.
No, they were not really afraid of that, were they?
Some were, sir, but I will say, they were quite relieved when you laid down your sword, took off your uniform, and said that you wish to go back to your own personal battle.
I admit, I may or may not have mildly intended that consternation for a few moments. Just to see the looks in their faces. They put us through a lot, those 8 years of conflict.
Oh.
Shoes I take next. I'll start with boots. I left my jacket in the stable.
Of course, sir.
I find that the situation requires a great deal of handling and tact with the people of Congress. The reality of it is you'll have to hold it on a little more. Thank you. The reality of the situation with Congress is that there is so much complexity moving forward, and I think they're all very concerned what this new government system will look like. None of the articles are put into place, but the truth is, how it works, whether it does or not, I don't care. For I am no longer involved in public life, and that is the way I hope for the next remaining years of my life it will remain. And I think you'll probably very much enjoy not having to deal with those complexities.
Oh, indeed, General. As exhilarating as it often was on the battlefield, it is nice to have stability at home, sir.
Another question. Do you think the faces on the gentlemen at Congress look somewhat similar to the faces of fellows underneath gunfire for the first time?
General, I believe you're referring to a little incident in Monmouth.
No, that was not on my mind at all.
I must admit, sir, well, General, you must understand, of course, I, as your faithful servant, of course, oh, thank you, sir. Of course, I just wish to have some of the valet and the other servants of your staff, of course, go up and see that fine point upon the heights. Took your spyglass, of course.
Wow. You always used it better than I did.
Well, sir, I learned from the best from surveying.
Thank you.
And of course, as you will remember, that those we saw the British guns. Surely they weren't within range, but we quite quickly found out that they were indeed within range.
You all made a very pretty picture on the top of that hill.
There was
You standing there. Were you on horseback? No, you were not. You were on foot. The other fellows around you, all in their fine various liveries and all the frippery and finery that their gentlemen had provided for them. And then when those cannonballs began zipping overhead, you know that slight throbbing sound it makes as it breaks through the air.
6-pounder, sir. Not mistaken.
Not quite high enough to make that whistle, but you still hear that noise. Nothing quite like it. You were the only one who didn't scatter like a chicken.
Well, I did move at a quicker pace, sir.
You did turn and walk away quite swiftly, but it was
Indeed, I
not the panicked consternation that struck everyone else.
I must admit, sir, it was a tad exhilarating. I can see why sometimes you would find the whistling of musket balls somewhat pleasing to your ear.
It's a thing I think perhaps most people will never understand, and I am very glad that is the case.
General, I hope and pray that you will take some time off now that we're back home.
No, you know me, William. I have
That's why I
business to
asked, sir.
attend. Why, it'll be fine. I have things I have to take care of. The farm is hundreds of pounds into debt already. We are already crushed by the reality that there's been no pay coming in. You know what happened where Lund gave off all those goods and services to the British when they sailed up the river. There's very little left on the property itself. We have to find some way of replacing that lost value.
Mayhaps a day.
For myself?
Indeed, sir.
Are you asking because you wish to have a day off as well?
No, sir, well. I do not, sir. I just know that Mrs. Washington will ask me if I have asked you if you have taken some time off.
I will take that into consideration, but I cannot say that I would be able to take a full time to myself.
Of course, sir.
That being said, would you like some more time than just this evening?
If I may, sir. I would like to see, of course, Frank, my new niece, and,
Ride the properties again,
of course,
familiarize yourself with the new people.
in general, if there's, since you are asking, could I mayhaps trouble you of my wife?
What's your request?
Well, sir, now that the war is over, now that her obligations to the army have been fulfilled, now that, of course, there is much liberty now, perhaps you could make a way for her to come to Mount Vernon.
You know I do not like her very much.
I understand, Colonel, but rest assured, I will make sure that she is not in your way. We should be on the outskirts of the property, if that's what you desire.
So you wish to have her brought here if possible, you wish to have a job given to her to support her in her recent arrival, you wish to have a place for yourselves away from life if possible?
If you offer, sir.
If I offer. Troublesome woman. I will send inquiries. I'll write to my friend in Philadelphia, the colonel, and see if he can find a way to have her brought here safely, to ensure her safe passage, to ensure she's not molested along the way, to ensure that she arrives in one piece. As long as it would make you happy, I am willing to condescend to that request.
I thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I will rest assured, sir, I will make sure she's not a bothersome.
As to your time to yourself, that in consideration, I will have need of you, not tomorrow, not the day after, so I think I can give you 2 or 3 days.
Thank you, sir.
And then you can have the Sabbath off as well.
Thank you, sir. I much appreciate that.
Well, before Mr. Finegan arrives, if you would not make official, you've already cleaned the wet goods, never mind. I'm going to take a moment, and I will be back momentarily if you would see him in.
Of course, General.
Very good.
Good to be home. Mr. Finegan, welcome, sir. Please, by all means, have a seat.
Mr. Lynn, thank you very much,
course,
sir. I greatly appreciate that.
And sir, if you will excuse me, I will fetch the gentleman for you.
Please.
Mr. Finegan, no, do not feel the necessity to
Your
stand.
Excellency.
Oh, it's my
Sir.
pleasure. Glad to have you here.
Pleasure's
Please,
mine.
take your
Thank
seat.
you. Welcome home, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Welcome home.
It is good to be home. So, I understand that you have questions and curiosities to ask about myself and my man Will here in our time in conflict and our time together. So I would ask that you feel the willingness to do so in front of the assembled company as ever you see fit. I will speak as openly and honestly as I seem appropriate.
8 years together,
Yes, sir.
side by side, with the exception of Monmouth. William, you literally carried a general's spyglass into battle. So all he needs to do is this, right?
Sir.
You're armed through the conflict. An armed slave. Lawful?
Oh, no, completely illegal. But I don't care. The reality of it is, if you look at Virginia law, in particular Virginia law, but this is true across many colonies. Some are different than others. Every colony has, well, I should say state now, Commonwealth, has at some point in time had some semblance of slave law. There are enslaved people in each place. Each one interprets it somewhat differently, but as far as Virginia is concerned, there is a great discrepancy in how we treat various levels of society. So not only slaves are banned from owning weapons, but free blacks are as well, as are Catholics. Everyone understands why Catholics can't have guns. Can't trust them at all. So the reality is that when you look at these questions and considerations, in order to arm a slave or a free black is considered dangerous due to the nature of their situation. The more that slaves are armed, the more likely there is for trouble, obviously. And free blacks have been banned from such ownership due to one very simple reason, the potential association that they would have with their enslaved brethren. However, on my property, I've made it a practice to ensure that at all times I have several of my people, trusted individuals, and many of them who own weapons of their own. They have been given that permission. I will purchase them shot and powder if they hunt for me. And they've actually been, on my property at Mount Vernon, they've been instructed that if there are anyone who comes upon my land and poaches, whether they are, doesn't matter who they look like, whether they're gentlemen from Alexandria, which happens quite often, or poorer folks, which happens, oddly enough, much less than the gentlemen of Alexandria. They have been instructed that they can take those men under force of arms, take their weapons from them, bring them to me, and I will pay them out of bounty. Again, completely and totally illegal. But the truth is, if I'm on the field of battle and I have my body man with me, he is the closest person to me and therefore is the most likely to carry an arm to ensure that protection. And at the end of the day, who's going to stop me? The beauty of it, William and I discussed this a few nights ago, the complexity of this ownership of weaponry, is that my people and my property are owned by me, they are my property, so therefore their guns are also mine. So if someone asks me whether or not I have given my people permission to own their own weapons, the answer is no, they're all mine. Laws enforced, laws in force are two totally different things.
Virginia slave law through the years, can't own a dog, correct?
At one point in time, that was prevented, yes. Still, think of the laws in Virginia with slavery as very reactionary in many cases. You go back 150 years to our earlier shores, we do not have canonized law in such places. I've not been alive for this entire process, so understand too that my understanding of this is limited because of my lack of experience. But as I have seen it, it is very clear that in many cases that the laws in Virginia as it regards to slavery have always been in response to something. And first, Africans being brought here, 1619. The first individuals who came were brought over by the Portuguese, captured by English privateers, brought to Virginia. And then we did not, frankly, know what to do at that time. So many of them began as indentures, which is how free blacks came to Virginia. But then within 20 years, those laws began changing to restrict those circumstances. Bacon's Rebellion shifted things a great deal. There's the poorer classes against the wealthier individuals of society, and so free blacks and poor whites, and even some natives, not as many, but some, were all working together to protest the abuses of, in those days, the extreme aristocracy of Virginia. And after that, you began to see a separation of those races through legislation. Indians were separated from the blacks by hierarchy, but yet still below the whites. And then you continue to see as time went on. So first off, it was if you became a Christian, if you were not white, you would be freed. Then that changed to that would not be the case, and then it eventually shifted to it's 2 or 3 generations, and then it would shift to freedom, and then that changed. And then it shifted to the condition of the mother dictates the condition of the child, and then that changed, and then one thing after another to eventually devolve into the situation that we now have in Virginia, which just changed, in fact. Before last year, in 1782, it was illegal to free a slave in Virginia. You could not do it. Under the English system, the only way to, in Virginia, find a path to manumission was if you performed meritorious service. William would be a good example of this. Lifetime of service, trusted, faithful, even in time of conflict. Saving someone's life, creating a medicinal remedy, or, frankly, most commonly, informing on an insurrection. And then, if your master believes that that individual was valuable enough to have that freedom given to them, then by law they had to go to the governor and the governor's council of Virginia, the king's representative, bring that forward, and then the governor and the council would determine whether they thought the case was valuable enough to find manumission. Last year, Virginia, under this new system of government, having thrown off the shackles of tyranny of Mother England, just passed a law that allows a man or woman who owns people, for any reason, to free them as they see fit. With some caveat. There must be a cash bond put up equal to their value, so that they do not become wards of the state.
State doesn't want to see road slaves unemployed.
Correct.
living in
And
this.
they also do not feel that it is appropriate for the people who did not benefit from that man or woman's labor during their lifetime to bear the burden of helping them transition from a enslaved state to a free state. It is the responsibility of the owner to therefore pay that financial burden.
So William in particular comes to you in 1768, along with his brother Frank, from the Lee family. At auction? Or
Just before, William, since we were discussing, feel free to have a seat if you wish.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen.
The complexity of this early time, William, and William, if you have faults on this, you're welcome to share them without any concern. Speak as freely as you see fit. When William and Frank first, William's brother, when they first came up for potential purchase, it was a strange time. I had been in the properties engaging in shifting my lands from tobacco to wheat cultivation. So my understanding of the need for a large labor force had shifted somewhat. Also, there was another added complexity in that my wife owned a significant amount of property from her first husband. Well, had access and right to a significant amount of property from her first husband. She did not own any of it outright. She had life rights to it, but including people. Our household staff in those days was mostly made up of Custis Dower property. And as I frankly became more and more influential in Virginia, it was more and more problematic, not legally, but socially, to maintain this stratification. The implication being, as the guardian of the Custis estates, it is my responsibility to ensure that I'm not gaining, except from my wife's third, any financial benefit from. And the argument then could have been made by some that by my household being maintained by the Custises, I was walking the line of legality by benefiting from these individuals' labor without the right to do so. So there was an opportunity then to expand my household as I became more prominent with individuals that I owned myself outright, as opposed to borrowing them from the Custis property. So when William and Frank came available, there were some complicated circumstances. Their master, Colonel John Lee, one of the Lee family of Virginia. They are everywhere. You cannot throw a rock in Virginia without hitting a Lee, and they will throw them back and add a few of their own. He passed away, and as is often the case in Virginia, died in a massive amount of debt. And the best way, best is not the right word, the most convenient way in some cases is to sell off your workforce. His widow, his second wife, decided to put up several people, including William and Frank, at an estate sale. I knew of this, and before the sale was in effect put into place, I inquired about the potential of purchasing the brothers. 61 pounds, 15 shillings for William, Billy in those days, and 50 pounds for his brother Frank. And so that was the process by which that came about. Complexity there.
Very complex.
Very.
You're explaining the Custis slaves in the house, the Dower slaves. Would they not ultimately intermarry with the Washington slaves, creating an even more dire circumstance for the future?
Yes. Oh, your brother married Lucy.
Yes, General.
If you wish to share about that, you're welcome to.
Oh, thank you, sir. Yes, my brother Frank married a fine woman, Lucy. Wonderful cook, daughter of one of the elderly cooks, Dahl. She has been in Mount Vernon Old for many years.
Since 59?
Indeed, sir.
And with my wife for 7 years before that.
Indeed. So she's considered our matriarch, sir. And she will always
She's
remind
considered
us.
everyone's matriarch.
Indeed, General. She will always remind us of that. Truly, she shall. But yes, Frank has married her daughter, Lucy, and because of that, of course, recognized by the General, and we are thankful for that permission. And their family has grown, as having a new niece. They already have 2 sons, as it were. Now they have a little girl. And if I'm not mistaken, perhaps soon, I believe Lucy's sister will soon be married as well.
Mm-hmm. So much has changed.
You carry the Lee name.
Sir.
Care to tell us about that? You've taken the name that was given to you, you took it on your own?
I mean, General, I took
Just
that,
with care.
of course, sir. Sir, I just took the name for myself. I was owned by the Lee family. It became my surname. My brother, Frankie, also took the surname Lee. Give us some ties of familial to the Lee property. And of course, as the General has said, the Lees do have a reputation, indeed. Some may call it a fine reputation, others not so fine reputation. But I've often said that we Lees come from very good stock.
If I may expand a bit, it is not uncommon for those. William and Frank, when they came to us, were highly skilled, had great potential, but also were very young, both under the age of 20. I do not know your actual birthday. They fell in the category of being young enough to pass as under 16 years old, so I assumed that they were until 70, 71. There was another wrinkle to that acquisition, which did not completely play into my decision making at the time, but is worth noting. William and Frank look very much like their father.
Who we think was Colonel John Lee.
You said it, not me, sir.
So you've made the inference that possibly Mrs. Lee
The
felt
second-
more comfortable that these young men were no longer on her plantation.
As she was about to be remarried for the third time.
And General, you mentioned the age of 16. That's an important age in Virginia. You care to expound upon that?
Oh, I'd be willing to. 16 for both free and enslaved individuals is the year that you become considered tithable or tithable. It's a tithe paid to the Church of England. In free society, every able-bodied male, 16 and older, pays a tithe to the Church of England to support not only the crown, but also the care of the glebe lands and the poor and the orphans in their community. That law was eventually expanded to include both free and enslaved laborers. However, in the case of enslaved people's circumstances, it is both male and female that are tithable. So every year, I pay a tithe on 70 or so people on my property. So frankly, with the fact that William and Frank both look to be under the age of 16, the longer I could keep them off the tithable list, better for my pocketbook in that circumstance. And I had a fine line to walk. I'm a member of the vestry, so I adjudicate these things, and so I had to be very careful just how much I push that line. Although it's an appointment for life, so once I have got it, I can't get rid of it. So it's fine.
That'd be a Pohick.
Yes, but in Poet Parish.
Very good, sir. So tell us about your 8 years. You travel as a member of the Second Continental Congress, and I think, William, you were at the First Continental Congress as well, 1774 at Carpenter's Hall. Now the Congress is meeting the second time at the Pennsylvania State House. I think that name would change sooner or later, but at the Pennsylvania State House in the spring and early summer of 1775, you are selected to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and for at least a 6-year period, Mount Vernon being home to both, you do not return home. You're on the road literally for a 6-year period. The relationship grows. You're together day in and day out. William, in a gathering of your generals, the night before an important battle, William is the only non-military person in the room.
Mm-hmm.
You trust him enough to be in that room as these things are discussed.
Mhm.
Waiting the table. Originally a waiter at Mount Vernon.
You know what, sir?
General, do you care to tell us about at least those 6 years leading up to the Yorktown campaign?
I think we both have things to say on that subject, if you wish to share them as well. Now, William, when he first became my valet, we began testing that process out before the war even. 70, 71, you went with me to the Ohio Valley. That was an eye-opening experience, I think, for you,
Oh,
wasn't
indeed
it?
it was, General. That's a beautiful, beautiful
Ah.
territory.
Was Dr. Craik on that
He
trip
was,
with you?
he was, he was. We got to meet with several of my old companions from the war against the French. Guy Thuda is a Seneca war chief that I knew from when we were younger men. Got to show William Great Meadows, Fort Necessity, where Braddock's defeat occurred, remembering all those men that lost their lives there. So I think in those days, you probably got a bit of a taste of my previous military experience just through traveling
Oh, yes,
in those
indeed, sir.
circumstances.
Indeed.
So when the Congress came and then the appointment to general came, I knew I would need an individual with me in ways that I had never had before. And during the 7 years where I had hired men serve as my batmen, my valets, Bishop and Alton, both of whom worked well. Bishop's passed away now, but
At Mount Vernon.
they both work at Mount Vernon, or still do. But having someone permanently affixed to that was worthwhile. And William had demonstrated his incredible competence, his ability, his wisdom, and most importantly, his trustworthiness, reliability. Regardless of what the circumstance was and what his opinion of the situation would be, I knew I could count upon him to accomplish what was necessary. And perhaps the most important, in my opinion, of all of those qualities that I value is complete and total discretion. I never have had a question in my mind that something said in confidence in front of Will would ever leak away from those situations. So he was in many ways the perfect man to have in a room of the ilk for two reasons. One, complete reliability on my part, and two, no one else typically noticed he was there. Which means I could count on him to tell me what was going on when I wasn't present. I don't know, what were your thoughts on that experience? Again, feel free to speak openly.
Thank you, General. The General is correct. And he well knows that some of his staff did not care too much for his leadership.
That's an understatement, but it's all right.
Indeed. Well, of course, sir, you remember the conflict involved.
Mm-hmm.
But it was quite fortunate that I was able to be with the General in those times. Long 6 years. And, the General at times gives me much too credit. I must admit, sir, that it was truly because of Mrs. Washington. I remember, and General, I'm not sure if you were aware of this, but I remember when you were going to the carriage, before I had all the bags and portmanteau of all the supplies, Mrs. Washington stopped me. And she looked at me, she gave me a very stern look, a very caring, stern look. And she told me, William, take care of him, for all of us. And I took that to heart. And I hope I succeeded in taking care of him enough, although, as I said, sometimes, you know, you can stand or take a few days off, but that is a battle that I'm sure that I will never win.
No, never.
So generally, you're coming back to your farms. You resigned your commission, as we talked about earlier in Annapolis. You're given the nickname the modern Cincinnatus.
Yes.
Cincinnatus, being a Roman general, fights for the Republic and desires nothing more than to return to his farm. End of the year 1783, you're looking forward to farming. Will still serving as your valet. Probably, hopefully, never to leave the property again.
That's the
for
hope.
any period of time.
I prefer to avoid it if at all possible. I've had my fill of conflict in public life, frankly. I don't know, it's one of those challenging questions when it comes to property and engagement and my business. There's nothing quite like being at home. I am a good soldier. I am well accustomed to conflict and violence. I'm well aware of this. But the reality is that when I come home to Mount Vernon, it is truly a place of refuge for me. One that I cherish a great deal. So to return, having accomplished this task, which was to initially defend our liberties against our mother country, and eventually after that to separate from that country, and then establish and win a conflict against an army and navy that we had no hope of winning against. It's about time I sat down for a few moments, thankfully. But also I'm tired. I am very tired. And it is good to be here. These halls carry so many memories of my brother, of my wife's children, both of whom are now gone.
The property's been in your family since 1650?
For quite some time, yes.
Your
Great grandfather, I think.
John. And you've expanded it to
It's almost 7,500 acres now.
ultimately.
I hope to hold the entire peninsula.
And as a surveyor, as a young man, for Lord Fairfax, 6th Lord Fairfax, William, you survey with the general as well? You've become a proficient assistant to a surveyor?
I've tried, sir. Indeed, truly, I have tried. You must understand, sir, it is, and with all due respect.
No,
General,
it's all right.
I understand why Mrs. Washington often sends me with the general, because it is very difficult to keep up with the general. Truly it is. That is why often, as you well know, and the general is a fine horseman. Truly, he is a fine horseman.
Careful.
Sometimes too fine of a horseman.
Well said, thank you.
Too fine of a horseman. In which, of course, I must make sure that I can keep up with such a fine horseman, that he does not injure himself, that he does not find himself in any peculiar circumstances, which is why, especially during the war, there have been times in which the general will go about upon the battlefield to rally his men, and I would do one turn and he is gone. And I must get on my horse and dash right to him to make sure that his body is protected. Because heaven forbid, if he were to be shot or be maimed in any sort of way, I know that I would never hear the end of it from Mrs. Washington.
Princeton in particular?
Indeed, sir. Indeed. Oh, you were quite furious in that battle. Oof, you were quite furious, General. If I'm not mistaken, was it not Charles Lee, sir?
No, that was Monmouth.
Monmouth, that was correct, sir.
Princeton was the one when we were on the battlefield, and there was that bridge.
Ah,
And
yes,
I
sir.
rode the horse
Yes, sir.
onto it to
Yes,
try
sir.
to prevent the men from retreating, and I was, 30 feet away from
Yes,
the
sir.
British line at that point in time? I
Mm.
remember Kirk Tillman was with me, and you were just on the other side of the bridge, and I remember,
correct, sir.
afterwards hearing Tillman shouting, "God's sakes, General, come back." And I remember seeing you put your hand on his shoulder
Sir.
and just shake his head, your head.
As I said, he will never win that battle, sir.
We could barely turn the horse around, it was his chest, remember,
Indeed,
pressed up
yes.
against the boards?
But in order to keep up with the general on the battlefield, then we will quote a fellow Virginian, former friend,
Oh, Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson.
And
that's a whole nother chapter.
that's a whole nother
The
conversation.
one up in that woman that realized you just home from the war.
It's all right.
Jefferson, we refer to you, General, as the finest horseman of your age.
I complimented someone else for once, what a surprise.
Prior to the war, I think prior, you're quite the fox hunter
Yes.
on your property, and Will is made your huntsman.
Mhm.
In order to keep up on the hunt, can we say that Will would have been the second finest horseman of his age?
One could perhaps argue that in some ways he would have to be better. I find keeping up with someone is a lot harder than leading someone in many cases. And prediction is part of it. No, Will's a fine horseman. And good with the dogs as well.
Oh, yes, General. There is just something about being on the hunt and just going at the break of wind and just going to the quarry and seeing the dogs and their excitement. And I admit sometimes I will get caught up within excitement myself, and at times I would even concern many of the other enslaved and your workers that I would perhaps risk my own life by going at such a breakneck speed, but it was fun.
Your answer has me reflecting on a moment, if I may. No, this conversation was intended to be about our relationship and conflict, and we have discussed these things. However, for the sake of those assembled and for yourself, sir, to allow for more direct questioning, I realize that my presence, I think, may be an impediment to some of those questions that you might be able to ask were I not here. No, you and I know the truth in these situations. So, what I'm going to suggest, humbly, is that I absent myself for a time. Your answer about the foxes and how much you enjoy it made me think and reflect on this. So I will leave for a time, and William, you then will be able to speak freely with those here assembled without my presence. And I will go so far as to say this as well, that you will do so without fear of any reprisal for any honesty you may wish to express.
Gentlemen.
Mr. Finegan, friends, if I may, with your permission, that I may relax myself.
Of course.
Thank you. I thank the General for that liberality. So, sir, if you have any queries of myself, so that I will
Sure.
answer them openly and honestly as possible, sir.
So it's a livery you've got on?
Yes, sir.
You're wearing the colors of the Washington family. The family's important enough, they have their own colors.
Indeed, sir.
You live and work in the mansion house, which is the center of the plantation universe. And you are at the, if you'll allow me, you're at the pinnacle of the slave hierarchy that is on that plantation. Your cloth is expensive, your buttons are expensive, you've purchased buckles in a jewelry store in Williamsburg for your shoes, or General Washington's made that purchase for you. As you ride about the farms, maybe leaving the estate to fetch the general's mail in Alexandria, which you do once or twice a week,
Occasionally, yes, sir.
you see with your own eyes the lower echelon of the slave hierarchy, the field hands. You likely sleep in a room that's got a brick floor, a brick fireplace, where the field hands are living on a dirt floor with a wooden and mud fireplace. Do you, as an enslaved individual, and this is a difficult question, do you feel any remorse for those people? You're both enslaved, but you are living a different life as an individual working in the house than those that work on the farms. As difficult as that question may be.
Well, sir, to your point, and please do not mistake me when I say this, but I don't understand how I could have remorse. I did not choose this life. I did not choose to be part of the Lee family. I did not choose to be sold to the Washingtons of Mount Vernon. I did not choose to be his valet. I did not choose to be his manservant. I did not choose to go to war with them. So it is difficult for me to have any remorse on a choice that I had no control into. But to that, I do feel much sadness. I do feel much pity. As you said, sir, it is a different station. I've seen all through Virginia, not just with us who are enslaved, but also even those who are free. There is still yet a staunch dichotomy, a staunch hierarchy between those who are more privileged, those who are given more. Now, to that effect, because I am given more, I have more responsibility. I do have more responsibility for the personal protection and safety of General. I have my brother Frank, he himself, he has the keys to the liquor cabinet. He has the keys to the library. When Mrs. Washington was gone at Valley Forge to visit us, it was Frank who was in charge of the house, being a butler. Much responsibility, much risk in that responsibility, much reward in that responsibility. So there is complexity in that, sir. I just hope and pray that now that we have won the war, now that we have these liberties now as our own country, that those things will change. As the general has said, 'tis illegal still to pay your enslaved workers. 'Tis illegal to give us any type of coin for any work that we do, but he sees it fit that we should have coin, that we may purchase our own buckles, that we may purchase our own supplies, foods, even clothing. So maybe a change is coming. I pray it comes sooner enough.
And I think what you're insinuating is that some enslaved individuals that fought with masters during the war were, with a successful outcome, were given their freedom and did receive their freedom. You've seen that. You
Yes.
lived with those people. Did you ever consider that General Washington may free you as a result of your service to him during that 8-year period?
I had hope. I had prayed. I had wondered that with my continued service to the general would merit that. Now, especially the law has changed in Virginia, now that any owner may manumit their slave under any condition. Only time will tell, sir. I do hope that given his experiences in the war, given the new foundation of this free country, that will continue to pervade his heart that I should be set free. And if that were to come about, I do not think I will leave Mount Vernon, though. It is home. Frank is here, his wife is here, his children are here. Maybe one day my wife will be down here as well, that we can continue to grow the Lee family. So even if he were to set me free, I think I would still stay and continue to serve him.
Tell us about your wife, Margaret. She's in Philadelphia.
Yes, sir.
You were married in what year?
So we were married in, if I recall correctly, we got permission from the general around 1777.
So you did need permission.
Indeed, sir.
Did she travel with the Army or did she stay in Philadelphia?
She traveled with the Army, sir. Her being a laundress, a cook, there were times she couldn't travel, or just for the nature of the movement of the troops. But I remember when I first met her, sir. Of course, she was filthy. She just finished cooking. She was still doing laundries, but she had such a bright smile, just such a smile that could. And gentlemen, those of you who are married, you know, just such a smile that you knew that no matter what kind of day you were having, that smile would just make everything okay, just make everything fine. And we got along very well, better than I expected, to be fair.
And she's a free woman,
Indeed, she is, sir.
but you still needed permission from General Washington to marry her.
I did.
And what was it about Margaret's personality that she did not see eye to eye with the general, or the general did not see eye to eye with her?
Gentlemen, I'm sure for those of you who are married, you well know this. My wife speaks her mind. And she will remind you that she speaks her mind. I think that gave the general much annoyance because of that. And mind you, she is a fine worker. She is very respectful, but when there are things that she sees as, how am I put this politely, as bullpucky, she tends to call it out. She tends to make her mind known. But that is what very much attracted me to her. That she was a strong-willed woman and that she would do whatever it took to make sure that she made her way in this world, not just as a Negro, but as a free Negro woman.
She lives in Pennsylvania where there's, freedom is more pervasive than obviously in Virginia.
Oh, yes, sir.
She did not follow you to Mount Vernon. You needed, even though you were married, you still needed to seek permission from General Washington to bring her to Mount Vernon.
Yes, sir.
You sought that permission, you were given that permission, and yet Margaret did not make the trip. Is the thought possibly that as a free black woman, she feared moving to an area where slavery is pervasive and that she may at some time be taken as a slave?
That is a risk, sir. Truly it is. A free Negro in this society is still, if I may even argue, at more of a risk than those of us who are enslaved. Because for those of us who are enslaved, we're considered property, we're considered owned by our owners, and therefore if anyone wishes to molest us, to destroy us, or to take us, they must go to our owners first for that permission. But as a free Negro, it is a grave risk. Now, of course, traveling to Pennsylvania, she is at no very mitigated risk. Being a colony that is, of course, has many of the Quaker who have been staunch abolitionists, as well as those who have many beginnings of free Negro societies. Traveling to Pennsylvania will not be the issue, but indeed, as soon as she crosses the border into Maryland and coming to Virginia, then she has much more risk. That is why I hope and pray that with permission from the general, that she would take a safer, quicker route through the river, that she may even go down the river and on top of the Potomac and come right to Mount Vernon there. There she will not be at risk of being molested or being accused of being a runaway. Unfortunately, many will say that she may have forged her papers, she has forged some type of pass or things of that nature. Some of you remember what happened in 1740 in the Carolinas with Stowe Rebellion, that many slaves are writing out their own passes and their own freedom papers to get arms and munitions for this potential rebellion. Of course, they passed their own law that says that slaves must no longer write, but they must know how to read, but they must read the text of Scripture, so that they be more docile slaves, because the first things we're often taught to read is the Scripture, and one of the first passages we are taught is from Ephesians. Slaves, obey your masters. So it is risky for her, but I'm hoping that she will get passage through the river or by sea.
I wish you luck in that regard.
I thank you, sir.
The mansion house at Mount Vernon, from a distance, looks large. When we arrive, especially before the additions began during the war, not yet completed, when the general arrives home, at least the dining room.
Yes.
As you get closer to the mansion, and I was just able to visit there recently. You weren't there, but
I'm sure you saw Frank.
Yeah.
I'm sure he let you in, sir.
I did actually pass through the front door for the first time.
Very good, sir.
The mansion house is small, and you touched upon it earlier, being a servant in the home comes with greater responsibility.
Yes.
You are under the constant watchful eye of not only General Washington, but Mrs. Washington, who takes a larger role in managing the house.
Yes.
Along with the female house servants, which are almost all primarily dower slaves, correct? The relationship between Washington family slaves and dower slaves, is there ever any feelings of ill will that you're coming from two different vantage points?
Yes.
That one has more of an advantage over the other?
Sir, anytime, and I'm sure many of you know this, anytime that you have two distinct groups come together, there is always the potential for tension. Truly there it is. But at other times, there's also potential for camaraderie, which there has been. And of course, the dowry slaves of the Custis, they feel as though that, well, we have been part of the Custis family for years and generations. Of course, the Custis family being quite prominent, more prominent than even the Washington family. So while there is tension, for the most part, we know that we're all in the same predicament. We know that we're all under the same watchful eye of the General and Mrs. Washington. And so it behooves us to work together, to partner together, to make sure Mount Vernon is continuing to be profitable. For heaven forbid, if Mount Vernon were to continue to spiral out of debt, if we're continuing to go into such a state in which no work could be done, well, property must be sold to pay off the debt. And what are the first pieces of property to be sold off? Those of us who are enslaved. Now, I will say that there have been some who have been quite troublesome. It was recently, when I recently came, maybe within 3 years when I came to Mount Vernon, there was a fellow slave, I believe his name was, ironically, Will Shagg. A very troublesome man, truly. Prone to violence, prone to drunkenness, prone to running away. And to the point where it wasn't just, he would not get into altercations, physical altercations with the overseers and the fire manager, but he would also get into altercations with us as well, fellow Negroes. To the point where the General could not put up with it anymore, he could not put up with the violence anymore, he could not put up with his constant rebellion, that he sold Will to the Caribbean. As many of you know, the Caribbean is generally a death sentence. The only time I'm aware he has done that, because he caused such angst and tension and strife between us all. And the General, being a good military commander, of course, he believed that there should be good order and discipline. And Will was not contributing to that good order and discipline. And so he was sent off. And it has been peaceful since he's been gone. I do not wish for that type of punishment for anyone, but for the good of our family at Mount Vernon, it is better.
General Washington, I'm sorry, rephrase that. Colonel Washington traveled to Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia, over a 60-year period as a burgess,
Yes.
an elected member of the lower house. And when the government met, the majority of the people in that town were enslaved. When the general was dining with the governor at the governor's mansion or in a session at the house, you had more free time than usual. And you took advantage of that to become reacquainted with maybe folks that you lived with on the lead plantation, a cousin, a relative. You shared more of were able to share more of what was left of your African culture. You care to touch upon that?
Of course, sir. It was very busy time going to Williamsburg when the burgesses came together. Taverns were bustling, many men on horseback coming into town. At times, at that time, the Colonel Washington and I, we would try to spend time at Miss Christiana Campbell's tavern, because of course, the General being a Mason, Miss Campbell's late husband was also a Mason, and it was part of their, I guess, society beliefs that if one of their own were to be deceased, that they would help the family of one of their own. And so we would patronize Miss Campbell's tavern many a time. And I would have time to meet up with some of those individuals who I lived with before I was given to General Washington at Mount Vernon from the Lead Plantation. So much so that a few had begun gathering on part of the Lead Plantation for their own little Baptist services. A few of them gathered together, and so at times when I had liberty, I would go see them. Perhaps I would even go to some of the taverns. The tavern Negroes are very interesting. They truly are. They're very, very knowledgeable, very bustling, very industrious. It is quite a difference coming from the plantation of Mount Vernon to the bustling city of Williamsburg. As you said, sir, many many, I would even surmise over half of the population of Williamsburg look just like me. Very industrious people. And so, and I did have time for leisure time, so much so, as you mentioned, sir, to even buy some buckles for myself. The General allows me, when I have leisure time, to even read. So if I'm able to purchase some books for myself, I may read. So especially for Frank, given that he has the keys to the library out in Mount Vernon. But it was very busy, and of course, the General would be very much disposed of the meetings at the Capitol building. And he would be there for hours, and he did not like to be in those meetings. He did not. At times, he would request that I stay close to the door because he would try to sneak out because he did not like staying with pomp and circumstance with the government. I don't think anyone left to do that, quite personally. But it was a busy time, sir, but it was a experiential time. But sir, if I may, I wish to perhaps put on a different persona, if I may. And to let you all know that it is very important to understand from whence we come. Very important to understand the history of our great nation, the history of William Lee and General Washington. And so if he's available, I will have my colleague, Daniel Cross, come back within. And that we can just step out of character for a little bit to have a conversation with all of you. If you have any questions or curiosities of us about their relationship between Washington and Lee, it's better if we came out of character. We can kind of go to different periods of point of time. And just to give you all opportunity to really learn, because when we look at this relationship, when we look at the American Revolution, we look at slavery in the 18th century, it is very complex. It is very much a large subject to talk about, but I believe it is something that needs to be talked about. And so we want to give all of you this opportunity. If you have any questions or curiosities, please feel free to ask us at this time.
Oh, that's it. You said everything great.
Yes, sir.
How and when did the Washington and Lee College come about, and whether that was the same Lee or what's
I see your
Washington
question.
Lee?
Let me answer that, or you
Yeah,
can-
go for it.
Virginia.
But it's not the same Lee. It's the same Lee family.
Yeah,
but not
same
this
family.
particular
So
Lee.
Washington in his will leaves stock to Liberty Academy in Lexington, Virginia. So, correct? So they put his name on it. At the conclusion of the American Civil War, retired General Robert Edward Lee becomes the president of the school. So it becomes Washington and Lee. He, I think, dies there.
I think so.
War ends in April of '65. He dies in, he doesn't make the next decade, he dies in 1869. He's literally buried, entombed at the chapel at Washington and Lee. He had one horse for the entire war, Traveler. Traveler's buried right outside the door of the chapel where Lee is. But there's an interesting connection there. At the end of the long answer to a short question, at the conclusion of the Yorktown campaign, Martha's only surviving child dies. The Washingtons adopt 2 of her 4 grandchildren. One of those 2 is George Washington Hart Custis. He ends up building a house that overlooks the Potomac in Washington, D.C., and he names the house Arlington. He has a daughter, Mary, who marries Robert Edward Lee. So also in Lexington is the Custis Lee Art Collection. So a series of paintings that hung at Mount Vernon by different artists that are now in the museums in the basement of the building, the chapel that Lee's buried in. So it's all Washington related, even all the way back to the Park Custis days.
It's actually a fascinating connection to those 2 pieces as well. So that goes to the program you saw today. So William Lee, again, we don't know for sure if Colonel John Lee was the father of William and Frank Lee. It's a strong possibility. One could argue a probability. If not father, then
potentially close relative, brother, cousin, we're not entirely certain. Probably father. But what's interesting is that, so he's part of the Lee clan, and again, we talked earlier, that there are Lees everywhere in Virginia. So, interestingly enough, Robert E. Lee is probably related to William Lee, distant to second, third, fourth cousins. There's even further interest to this point, I find fascinating, is that, as Mr. Finegan said correctly, absolutely correctly, Arlington House is set up by George Washington Parke Custis. He named it after the ancestral Custis property out in the eastern shore. If you all go across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, about a mile inland on the left is the old Arlington House. That was where the Custis estates were, one of them. So that he renames Arlington after his great-grandfather, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. What's even more interesting is that George Washington Parke Custis is, of the 4 grandchildren, there are only 2 of them who follow Washington's footsteps and actually free their enslaved people. One of them, I think it's Eliza, frees them during her lifetime. Her Custis enslaved people. George Washington Parke Custis is the other, but he waits until his death to do so, which is very typical in the 18th century. Sometimes it's due to people just not wanting to give up what they have. Sometimes it's due to the debt is required. There's difficulties doing it because the debt, one of the reasons that Washington holds it off for so long. But he frees his individuals in his will and says that my executor will be the one who executes the freeing of these people. So Frank Lee's children are all part and parcel of that still. So it's interesting to find out that Robert E. Lee is the one who's the executor of the will. And he's the one who ends up having to, through law, free the Custis enslaved people, including his distant cousins in the Lee family.
So you're implying that there was a lineage factor that resulted from interracial kind of marriage?
There are definite connections all the way through.
It wasn't the reason that they were freed, but they were related.
But they're still all in the same circumstances. Yeah, they would not have recognized the difference.
So-
Probably wouldn't have known it. But
So
it was all part of the
newsflash,
process.
Robert E. freed slaves.
He did. By law, he freed.
Have we read that anywhere in the past 5 or 6 years?
Yeah,
Right?
okay.
Complex.
I,
And they were not his people. I make that very clear.
Yeah.
They were not
Yeah,
his
yeah,
enslaved
no,
people. They were his wife's enslaved.
I've often used the expression to get people ready for a lecture. Let's decompress, come to the realization, we aren't who we thought we were. We aren't who we think we are. We'll never be who we think we're gonna be. The quicker you come to grips with that, you become a sponge for learning, right?
Right.
So we're all at different age levels. So at a certain age level, you were taught Washington was great. Don't bring up slavery because it impugns his character.
Right.
Now we're at the other end of the spectrum, whereas now we say, don't talk about Washington being a slave owner. Let's not talk about him at all because he was a slave
Right,
owner,
right.
right? So the reason we do this is to open up the realities and not to preach, but the more we become that sponge that's willing to take in new thoughts and maybe new facts, the more we're going to learn and the better off we're going to be.
Of course, it's the same thing with the Jefferson lineage aspect. But
Yep. Yeah, so as Washington enthusiasts, we are not Jefferson enthusiasts. You can't,
Not at all.
You can't be both.
Yeah.
You can't be both.
Well, and to what Daniel was saying, this is why it's so important to understand. In the 18th century, there's so many complexities when it comes to slavery. And I may mention this the other night. 18th century slavery is not 19th century slavery. And again, slavery is abysmal. It is abysmal as a horrific institution. But in the 19th century, you see it as getting worse. It's a regression of what you see in the 18th century.
You can almost argue it's a escalation.
Escalation. But for example, in the 18th century, there's no law that says a slave can't read and write. Except for South Carolina, but that was just writing. But it was actually encouraged that you teach your slaves how to read and to write. Because one, increases their value, and two, you have now a workforce who can actually do specific tasks you desire to do. 19th century, gone. Keep them dumb, keep them servile, they're done, they're gone.
18th century slavery, the Church of England in 1732, 33, says that the enslavement of Africans is necessary to civilize them and to save their souls. So their education is to teach them in the church to Christianize those individuals. And basically you can look at that as an excuse to propagate slavery, but they're wrong word. They're using these mental gymnastics to try to justify a thing, whereas by the 19th century, it's continued to broaden of, they've just given up on the justification, and they just roll right into the actual ownership.
Ma'am, you have a question?
Yes, as two reenactors who think about these issues all the time, what is your perception of what seems to be going on in so many places of tearing down statues, renaming buildings, and how could we, I personally feel we're trying to erase history instead of better explaining it. How do you two feel about that, and what are you seeing on the horizon in terms of this?
You go ahead tackle this first. So it's a great question, and it's one that is in the zeitgeist of American concepts. We've been dealing with it for a while. It's taken various forms. You know, we've seen colleges have university changes. We've had these different kinds of things. So I'm about to do a very Washingtonian thing and dodge the question completely, because that's what I do. So I'm going to broaden this and talk about something that we like to talk about, and I normally end with, but I'm not going to end with it now because we've got some time left still, and I think it's worthwhile doing so. So bear with me. I will get to avoiding your question very quickly.
Okay.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I will
wanna
answer
add
your question.
One more part to it
Yeah.
also, maybe you guys will get to later, is how has colonial Williamsburg changed since I went there? Probably, and I'm 67,
Yeah.
I went there in the 60s.
Fair question. I will also very carefully avoid that question. So great. So when you're looking at we'll take the first part first, and I won't avoid the question. I'll just be very careful how I attach it. So in order to understand why I say what I say, if you'd asked me that same question 5-6 years ago before I started doing Washington, I would have immediately had a response. That probably would have made half the room angry and the other half of the room really excited. That's how these things work, right? The longer I've played Washington, my opinion of American politics, our current political situation, has fundamentally altered and changed. And so what I'm about to say is coming from this understanding of the 18th century world, which we all know has its good and its bad, and it's very, very ugly. So recognize that. So two things that have come to my mind as I've studied these things. One, history is not dates and names and outcomes. History is the people who made decisions that led them to do things. So, that being said, that's the part of history that we've lost in our American consciousness. We know the dates, we know the names, we debate back and forth in schools as much as we want to about what should and shouldn't be said. But underneath all those things, the reason why this kind of conversation is so rare is because we don't want to actually deal with the complexity of these things, and sometimes the very uncomfortable conversations that will come out of those things. So one of the things that we like to do is to say, forget the dates and names. Those are secondary. Why did people do what they did? Why did Washington fight for independence? Why did he own people? Why did he internally struggle over this question as time went on? How was William Lee's life altered? We don't know much about William Lee. We know more about him than 99% of the other enslaved people at the time because he was associated with a wealthy, prominent man. So we're fortunate is the wrong word. It's sad that we don't know more, but at least we know something. So that being said, now to Washington in this perspective. Our American concept, the thing that we exist in as a modern country, with all of its flaws, in the 18th century, they were trying to, imperfectly, create a system of government and thereby form a people under a really single principle. And I think most founders, if you actually pin them down and ask them, they would agree on this subject. So I'm going to say a couple terms that I'm going to have to define because they're different for you all than they are for the 18th century. So when I say virtue, you all think of nice behavior, appropriate things, the integrity, honesty, lack of cowardice, care, these kind of things. In the 18th century, when they say virtue, they mean one specific thing. It's a capital V virtue. They take it from the Latin, virtus. Virtue in the 18th century it's an individual thing, but it's actually more than an individual thing. It is specifically oftentimes tied to government. So in a government, those in authority should carry this principle of virtus, virtue, which when it's defined in the 18th century is care for your fellow man above your own interests. Following with me so far? No. Imperfectly applied, but that's the concept. So when you look at the three ancient forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, all three of them carry with it this concept of virtus. Monarchy is the most stable form of government. It's also the most tyrannical, prone to tyranny. Who has the responsibility to care for their fellow man in a monarchy? The absolute authority. The empire, the empress, the king, the queen, whatever it might be. In an aristocracy, which has its good and its bad, the good is those individuals in power recognizing their power and, frankly, virtue signaling to those underneath them to show how magnanimous and ethical and moral they are, which means they are acting in virtue. The danger of aristocracy is it very easily turns into oligarchy, which is the financial gathering of power to those individuals at the expense of their people, right? We're together so far? Yeah. Democracy, the most liberty-inclined form of government, is also historically the most fundamentally chaotic and unstable. Because in a democracy, everyone has to act with virtue. Because if you don't, you quickly find a tyranny of a majority, 51% punishing, enslaving, harming the 49. Right? So the most potential for freedoms, liberties, but the most inclined to take those away the moment one group gets a little more than somebody else, right? So this concept of virtus, virtue, is embedded in our American system, where they combine all three branches of these ancient forms of government. Monarchy, where does that show up in our American concept? Presidency, the executive.
Written around Washington.
Which eventually written around Washington, yeah. Aristocracy, we'll get to in a second. Democracy, we the people, right? The House of Representatives, the individual state legislatures. Where's the aristocracy? Senate. And in some cases, the judiciary. Appointments for life as opposed to elected, right? So by combining these things, then what they do is they say, well, in these positions of office that previously were held for noble office, any man can obtain those things, but they still have the semblance of that hierarchical structure. Imperfect, maybe, but that's the concept behind it. So when you're looking at this virtue question, Washington, if asked this question, would fall back on this concept. What is best for my neighbor? Now, what he would also say is education is the only way to maintain a democratic republic, which means that people must understand, embrace, and deal with their history so they may learn from it and then never repeat it. So, to your question, which I have so far artfully dodged, when it comes to removals of these kinds of things, my attitude tends to be what Washington's would be. Washington said in his lifetime, he knew he'd be a celebrity in his life. He said things like, what do I wish posterity would remember me as? For what I've done. And if what I have done meets the approbation of posterity, so be it. If it does not, so be it. Mm-hmm. So, what I then say is, if the people decide that must be done, so be it. With the understanding that we must not then forget what has been done, but find another way to remember and learn from those things. Does that answer your question? Very artfully. As to Colonial Williamsburg, and this is speaking as I'm not speaking as a ambassador of the foundation at this point in time. I'm speaking on my own right. So if they send you a letter, know that's in context. My opinion on Williamsburg has changed drastically. They are trying to tell a more complete story. They are trying to do their best to look at all these complexities. They're allowing me, when I'm on, I do a lot of work with talking about the enslaved reality of the 18th century. I talk a lot about indigenous relationships, which is a heretofore under-touched concept. Washington's life, by the time he's 26 years old, he's dealt with 35 separate Native nations. By the time he's the president, it's over 97. We never talk about that. The first.
There's certainly no black people in Williamsburg, I don't think.
Right, and now we have dealt with
I've heard there
that.
were only half the population.
Now we've changed that as much as we can, and we're trying to cross those boundaries. They're trying to cross those boundaries. But it's a long process, and it's a slow process, so we do as best we can.
Allow me 2 minutes to add a little context to why Billy Lee, right? So we ended our, kind of took our discussion up to the arrival of these two men home after 8 years on the road fighting the American Revolution. It's not quite over yet. 1783, do you know about the peace treaty in Paris yet?
Nope.
Okay, so.
I mean, they know it's effectively been signed,
so
they know the details of
You've
it.
essentially won, but it's not official yet. The two men would spend the rest of their years together. Billy would be injured on 2 separate occasions, breaking both legs. As a manuscript collector, I'm fortunate to own the doctor's bill that was given to Washington to repair his leg the second time he broke it. I think that's in actually an image of it in our second book. So Billy becomes a shoemaker on the estate. Washington, ever practical. Nobody should be on this estate. If you've got one useful leg and one useful arm, we're gonna find something for you to do. So Billy becomes a shoemaker because he gets sit and work. Washington, in his retirement, visits him almost on a daily basis, if not every day. Towards the end of Washington's life, Washington, as we know, is elected to be the first president of the U.S. Billy wants nothing more than to be able to travel with him to New York and eyewitness his inauguration. Reluctantly, Washington allows him to make that trip. When they get to Philadelphia, Billy's legs have gotten so bad that he cannot continue to New York, missing the inauguration. About 2 months later, if my estimate is correct, Washington receives a letter from his friend Clement Biddle. It says, Billy's perfectly healed and wants to come on to New York and see you as president. Ever practical, tell him to go home. He'll just be in the way. There's nothing he can do. Billy won't give in. Billy eventually goes to New York and sees Washington as president. I've always made the contention that they fought for this together, and Billy wants to see his pal as the president. Ultimately, back to Mount Vernon for Billy. Washington president, 7 of his 8 years in the city of Philadelphia, retires in 1797, back to Mount Vernon to be reunited with Billy. The reason that we tell this story is in Washington's will. He puts the finishing touches on a 28-page will on the 9th of July of 1799, and in decent health. Before the year's up, he's gone. And when his will is probated, we find that it's his wish, through some various complicated explanations in his will, that the people that he owns in his own right, roughly 123, 124 people at the time of his death, will be freed at the time that Martha passes. We made the point last night that essentially Washington has presented Martha with a T-shirt with a target in the middle of the back. Upon the decease of my wife, it's my wish and desire that the slaves that I own in my own right shall receive their freedom. So the slave community now knows that when she's dead, they're free. Equally important, he goes on to write just after that. And to my mulatto servant William, calling himself William Lee, and to slightly paraphrase, due to his attachment to me, notice he doesn't say my attachment to him, due to his attachment to me and his service to me during the Revolutionary War, he is to be granted immediate freedom. So we find out in reading Washington's will, there's only one slave mentioned by name. There's only one slave to be given immediate freedom. It's an incredible story. The will is still in existence. It's in, I think, Alexandria, Fairfax County. Is that where they're domiciled?
Yes.
But occasionally they lend that page to Mount Vernon to be on display in the museum. So to walk in there and read that name in Washington's handwriting is really an incredible thing.
I think it's an important thing to recognize, and we talked a lot about a lot of things, and I didn't hear what you guys were talking about part of the time because the door got closed and I locked myself out. But it's an important thing to recognize that Washington's opinions on slavery shifted over time in his life, and oftentimes he's been given the credit for his own development, which, you know, okay, fine. He's a very practical person. Before the war starts, he has some concerns with the institution economically and from an arbitrary perspective. But by the end of the war, he's almost 180 on the institution completely. Now, he still maintains enslavement until his death, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why and complexities, and we can argue what that looks like, and that's not the point I'm trying to get at. But there's one piece that I have, except for Mary Thompson, I have never seen a historian really dive into, is that there's one thing that changes in that 8-year period that he never engaged in before, is that he never had a personal enslaved valet with him permanently in any capacity, except for this man, not this man, William Wade, who's represented by Joe. It is my contention, and we've discussed this a lot, that one of the driving factors of Washington's changing opinions of the institution of slavery as a whole is not just because of his own growth, it is, but is a massive part of that is the close proximity with an individual that he cannot really avoid seeing its realities with day after day. So I am of the opinion that William is frankly the major shifter in Washington's changing opinions on slavery. By the end of the war, he says, I wish to be quit entirely of owning individuals, which is, nothing has changed. He's not been around lots of, he's been managing enslaved people even less than he was previously. There's no confrontation. He's not reading philosophy books. There's nothing that changes in his world that would put him more involved in that process, except for the fact that there is a man with him permanently in that capacity moving forward.
Because again, Washington didn't grow up with that. It's like his tradition or expectation in Virginia, especially at that time, is that as soon as you're a young, wealthy gentleman, even before you're a teenager, you will have an enslaved individual with you for your entire life. That was the way it was. Washington never had that. And especially, and that's why even
brothers do.
His brothers do, right.
We can find.
And especially when Washington first gets William Lee, he doesn't know what to do with him. Like, what do I do with this? Because he does everything on his own. So when you have someone say, well, no, you need this person for your status in society, you need this person to show that you are a man of means, and he's supposed to do everything for you and to protect you, it's like, okay, I guess I have to go to societal norms and figure this out. And to that point, I think that's having that close proximity is something that has Washington always been around slavery, yes, but to have slavery that really in his face like that, that changed the man.
And he had to come to grips with it in a way that he had been able to avoid before his life at that point. No other questions?
Ma'am?
I just wondered, for each of you, how portraying these men over time, has it changed you as a person?
Well, to be honest, this is the first time I'm portraying William Lee. So congratulations. So thank you. Now, I have portrayed other enslaved individuals. I have been doing historical reenactment for over 15 years now. I have done American Revolution, Civil War, World War II, World War I, Korea. My grandfather was actually in Korea, which is why I do it in honor of him. And one of the things that is one of the people who I constantly portray at Williamsburg is Gowan Pamphlet. He was America's first ordained enslaved black preacher. He was ordained in 1772. He actually founds the First Baptist Church in Williamsburg. They're actually developing that right now. And one of the things that I have really grown from in reenacting this song is how I have no excuse not to do the best I can do every single day, truly. These are men and women who were enslaved, who were relegated to edge society, who had everything against them, but yet and still persevered. So I have no excuse. I truly don't. And I understand, I get it. I 100% get it. And this is one thing Dan and I often talk about, because we go to different events, we do different things together. There aren't, and ma'am, to your further question, there aren't many black reenactors. There's just not. I understand why. I get why. It's a difficult subject. It's a difficult thing for you to put on clothes and portray someone who was enslaved or who were relegated to that society. I get it. And I've even had personal experience. I've even had not just white people, but other black people saying, "How dare you do this? How dare you put on these clothes and rehash your history?" And I just tell them two things. One, it's too important not to do it. Secondly, who better to tell our stories than us, right? So, and I take that with much stride, and I take that as a truly a humbling experience, being able to read over all the historical documents, read over the history, being able to interpret and reenact with people such as Daniel. And I'll be honest, he is one of the few people who I sincerely trust that I can really portray William Link, portray any enslaved individual with him, because he and I we've known each other for years. So we have that trust, we have that friendship there. And it does significantly help when I understand who these people are. It helps me understand better who I am, because I see it as part of all of our story. You know, my wife, she's over there. That's my wife Elizabeth right there. She has been incredibly supportive of me in doing all this, and the fact that I've been blessed to be able to reenact for so long. She's actually gotten into it as well, and one of the things we're doing, and this is a little sneak peek, so you guys at least he doesn't know about this.
Y'all are special.
So one of the things I am doing is I'm actually portraying Lemuel Haynes, who was also a black preacher of the 18th century, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, becomes the first black preacher to pastor an all-white congregation. And coincidentally enough, not only was he black and a preacher, he was also married to a white woman. And her name was Elizabeth Babbitt. My wife's name is Elizabeth. So, in the near future, Lord willing, when we have time, we plan on doing something to show their lives and how it was in the 18th century, being married to an interracial couple that way, being a minister of an all-white congregation, and also being a veteran of the American Revolution, all those complexities put into there. So I truly enjoy this hobby, I truly do. It's a lot of fun, and just being able to have someone walk away, even if it's just for 5 minutes talking to someone. If one person walks away and say, wow, I never knew that.
Yep. Read the book.
Mission accomplished.
I got nothing to add. Really, that's great.
Well, I would like to add, though, I had a black woman in my office one day, and she said, "What right does a white man have to write a book about a black slave?" I said, "I am half Sicilian." You have a question?
It's just a point, but I saw you 3 or 4 years ago, and you talked about the Iroquois, which it's their war name, it means like Rout's name. And they're named themselves as people of Longhouse.
Haudenosaunee.
And, you know, it's not that big of a deal, but,
So you're asking why I say that?
no, well.
I use the 18th century term for context. When I speak out of character, I try to refer to the Haudenosaunee themselves. The Iroquois in the 18th century were referred to by the Iroquois as the name that was given to them oftentimes by their enemies, and it's endemic. We never see the Haudenosaunee reference in any of Washington's papers, which is why I do not use that name when I speak in character.
So I guess when he said the first thing we do is make a treaty with the Iroquois, he said that was just like when he was giving advice to the country. He was
Right, yes,
the first thing we should do is make a
Correct.
treaty with the Iroquois.
correct. And he even breaks it down further. He breaks it down according to the various nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So the Seneca, the Cayuga,
And
etc.
another thing, the Seneca don't have chiefs. All the other bands
Correct.
have chiefs.
Correct,
The Senecas don't actually.
correct. But Washington doesn't know all that sometimes, so I have to play ignorant.
And I just want to say, truly, I want to give this man props. Truly, I do. After all the years of doing historical interpretation, he is by far the main man when it comes to any sort of history about Native Americans or indigenous people. Truly, he is, because even at Williamsburg, when I worked with him, he is so there's nation builders. So you have Washington, Patrick Henry. He is the only one of all of us as a nation builder who actually not only knows about the indigenous history, but also talks about it, honestly, ad nauseum sometimes. But truly, no, but it's great because it's not part of Washington's history that's not often talked about. So I just want to give him those props there. So.
Especially during his presidency too,
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
he had Native Americans
Always.
come to Philadelphia to meet with him
A
when he
week
was
did not
president?
go by without Native delegations.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of a fun little fun fact, and I'll answer your question. George the first, this is cool to me, to kind of show our lack of American history. What's the first war that America fought against a foreign power once it became the United States? Do you know? What do you all think?
Spanish American.
Spanish-American War,
Yeah.
War of 1812, another one, right? First war actually fought by the American Army in the Constitution was against the Seneca.
Anthony Wayne.
1790. Guess who won the first battle?
So,
Wasn't us. The Seneca.
Was that Wayne on
Yeah,
that?
before Wayne, but
They
then
were-
Wayne
they were
followed up on it.
destroyed, right?
Yeah, the first battle between the Seneca and the Continental Army was not good for the American states. And eventually they had a second battle and they did a little bit better. But then the Seneca showed up and were like, hey, we can keep fighting like this for a long time, or we can make peace. And they're all like, yeah, let's make peace. So the Seneca not only are the first war that we fight against a foreign power, but they're also the first native nation that had an official treaty with the United States. Which
Washington
then,
as president.
yeah, Washington was president, which was immediately broken by Thomas Jefferson.
You've been waiting a long
You've
time.
been so patient, Mike.
Your arm must be worn out.
You have made reference a couple of times to Baptists.
Yes.
You said the black population at Williamsburg had Baptists. Well, my understanding is, whether it's correct or not, was that the white population basically used the scriptures to convince or to bludgeon the black population that they should be slaves.
Oh, yes.
And that was not, well, I'm an American Baptist, and we're told that, yeah, somewhere there in the early 1800s, the black-white population split into American and Southern Baptists.
Yes.
Over that issue.
That is correct. There was, so prior to that split, so in the 18th century you have, and I say this because not only do I portray a Baptist preacher, I'm actually currently actively Army chaplain as a Baptist preacher, so that's why I like this stuff. I love church history. So in the 18th century, the one denomination, well, no, the two denominations, 1.5 denominations, that were truly abolitionists, bar none, were the Quakers, sometimes the Methodists. Methodists went half and half at times. Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans,
Dependent on the person.
depending on the person, absolutely. There were more contention. There was a lot more contention. You had different Baptist associations who advocated for slavery, those who did not advocate for slavery. Even during the War of Independence, you had Baptists who fought against each other for this very idea of slavery. As a matter of fact, Robert Carter III, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, actually the wealthiest man in Virginia.
Yeah, at that point. Yeah.
He had over 500 slaves. Became a Baptist, had an idea to manumit all of his slaves over time, called Deed of Gift. Highly recommend you read about it. It's the largest emancipation of slaves prior to the Civil War.
Airtight legally.
Airtight
His
legally.
kids tried to have the will thrown out so they could keep the people enslaved, and he locked it down so much that
Yep.
all of them lost the court case.
Yep.
After his death, he planned it so well that his kids, when
So
he would try to
well.
reverse it, would not be able to do so. It's a brilliant man, brilliant mind.
So after that point, you know, one of the Baptist associations he's part of is debating this idea of slavery. And because they can't decide, he ends up leaving and becomes a Swedenborgian, which is a different denomination. The main split that happens won't happen until 1828. That is when you have what at that point was called the General Baptist Convention at that time, or General Baptist Conference. There were some other issues as far as supporting missionary efforts, where to place churches, how to minister to different underprivileged communities. But the main linchpin was the issue of slavery. It could not be resolved, so in the conference of 1828, there was a split between the Southern Baptists and the Northern Baptists. And that split would continue to this day even. Now, the issue has since been, dealt with now, but there's still the issue today as far as ministry efforts, how to do ministry, how to have different, what is to focus on missionary work even across the sea. So that's why the split is still there. But yes, the main split was the issue of slavery because, again, the idea was that slaves obey your masters, whether this is right. There's actually a Bible that was made, I believe, in 1802, 1803. It was called the Negro Bible. And literally, it's a Bible that was made by the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, an arm of the Church of England, that actually took out different passages of Scripture. So, for example, the whole book of Exodus is gone.
Yep.
The book of Philemon, gone.
Is there an important thing to say about this real quick, though?
Yeah.
The Church of England.
Yes,
Yes.
the Church of England.
Not America, the Church of England.
Correct.
Who had a vested interest in maintaining slavery in the empire at that point.
Because the priests of the Anglican Church received monies from slavery because the main currency at that time was tobacco notes.
And the Church of England owned primary stock in the South Sea and East Companies, which were importing slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and North America.
And all the glebe lands too that they had to
So
work.
even after the American Revolution's over,
Yep.
the Church of England, until Wilberforce stops it in like the 1810s and 20s, is still propagating slavery, even though England doesn't have slavery. The colonies still do.
The Episcopal Church had the first black priest.
Say again, sir?
The Episcopal Church was the Church of England.
After it's
The Episcopal Church
Yes.
had the first black priest.
After it split away.
1790.
Correct. So after the war, the Episcopal Church actually Thomas Jefferson actually assists the Anglican Church still in America and say, what do? We don't be considered loyalists because we don't want to answer to the Bishop of London or the Bishop of Canterbury. And so with Jefferson's help, a little bit Madison too.
Don't give Jefferson too much credit.
Yeah, exactly. They actually found the Episcopal Church of America because as opposed to now answering to the Bishop of London, they answer to the congregation. It becomes more of a congregational feel. But as of recent history, there has been more communion with the Episcopal Church with the Anglican Church today.
So that question of religion starts in the
Yes.
18th century. There's multiple sides, and as the 19th century rolls, it starts turning heavier and heavier towards utilizing it as a bludgeoning tool, which is what we talked about earlier.
And real quick, as Daniel had touched upon earlier, you paid your taxes to the Church of England when you lived in Virginia.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
In the
Was it
entire
not
empire.
the Virginians took exception to it, maybe more than others, maybe not. But when they went to the Constitutional Convention, weren't the Virginians the one that said separation of church and state?
Separation of church and state actually does not utilize in the convention until Jefferson says it in a private letter, and it later is attached after the Constitution.
To the Danbury Baptist of
To the
Tennessee.
Danbury Baptist, absolutely.
And he made a point in his private letter. He said there must be a separation between church and state, not of. Because his argument is saying that anyone who wishes to enter public office, of course, there shall be no religious test for those entering public office. But Jefferson made a point that no one should separate themselves from their convictions because your very convictions are the things that actually motivated you to enter public office. So that's why he says you shouldn't separate of your convictions, but there should be a separation between, as in the ecclesiastical authority has their issues, the government authority has their issues.
Virginia does create a freedom of religion in
Yes.
Virginia, but yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I can see that I, as one of the sponsors, coordinating elements, that I have failed to adequately plan the appropriate time for this wonderful, yes, sir. But they'll be back. I guarantee that. I do have a round of applause again. Before we conclude, I'm going to suggest a few things, but I have a kind of a guest, not kind of a guest I want to bring up because he's a co-sponsor of our event today. But what we'd like to do is, after remarks of Chief Tara Landis about Carlisle building bridges, what we'll do is take a break. We have an official photograph to do with Molly Shane about our book presentation. So I just asked everybody to take a quick 5-minute break, bathroom break, water, come back in. Our guests will be here. You can engage with them one-on-one, and you may have some questions that you'd like to ask them, but they'll be here for a while, so we're not going anywhere. And of course, the books will be for sale. Some of the profits from those books will go back to the Cumberland County Historical Society, and of course, author Finegan will be here to sign those books as well. So I just forgot what I just said, but anyway, most importantly though, I would like to invite Chief Tara Landis, and I'm a proud member of the Carlisle Bridge Builders. It's a wonderful organization. And what you just did today, I didn't realize that you built a bridge for us back in time. And you really have started building a bridge that I can't see the other side yet. And this is why I love this organization, Carlisle Bridge Builders. So Chief, it's always good to be chief, being both of us Marines. It's good to be a chief. So Chief, the floor is all yours to talk about Chief Terrell Landis is one of the co-founders of Carlisle Bridge Builders, our co-sponsor. Please.
Good afternoon. Gentlemen, first of all, what a fine job. I wasn't sure where I was going when I came, but you guys brought me completely back around. You got me hooked. I wasn't sure. Much thanks to the reimagining War and Peace, or Peace, to Sherwood McGinnis. This whole thing, and Colonel Buren, what he's doing here is incredible. First of all, your community here, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. The mic there.
I can tell louder than that.
We got you, Marine. We got you.
First of all, Carlisle Bridge Builders. Who are we? What do we do? How did we get started? What's it all about? You look confused. So Carlisle Bridge Builders is a group of people here in Carlisle. It took off from the Carlisle Can. If you remember the Carlisle Action Network. And so we wanted a means of getting people together to talk about things that are going on in our society that we don't normally hear and talk about. How can we make connections with people that you wouldn't normally connect with? So Reverend Woodall from Bible Way Church, Reverend Jabelius, and I said, well, we can do this. Let's pull this group together. So right off the bat, we have Second Presbyterian, which is a predominantly white church.
Right.
Bible Way, predominantly black church. You all know there's something going on between black folks and the police, right?
Yeah.
They get me. They get me. And some of the conversations we have, we don't have any product. We do some service projects now and then. We did a food giveaway. We did a few things like that. We did a smoke detector installation. We've done a few things, but that's not what it's about. It's about building a bridge to populations that you wouldn't normally speak to. You wouldn't have any idea. That's what it's about. Talking to people that you wouldn't normally talk to or have interactions with. And what you'll find is that we have more similarities than differences. And that's important. So we meet every second Saturday, 10 a.m. at Bible Way Church. That's my commercial. Bible Way Church, over by the YMCA, 10 o'clock, side door, down the basement. You'll see us down there. But the idea, though, is that this group has been pretty incredible. I will give you an example. Do you know that poor people everywhere eat the same thing? How many of you know about collard greens?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
About him last night.
How about broccoli rabe?
There you go.
What's the difference? What's the difference between collard greens and broccoli rabe?
Italians eat broccoli, Rob.
That's pretty much it. I don't know if you heard me say Italians eat broccoli rabe. That's pretty much it. It's a green leafy material. But see, we wouldn't know that. So that's a similarity that we have. We can come together on that point. And even in reference to today's presentation, I love it. Let's teach history.
Yes.
Let's not talk about erasing it. Let's teach history the way it happened.
Yes.
You know, this is still an experiment. This thing could still go wrong, you know. This thing could still go wrong. You know, however, if we continue to have conversations with each other and we get to know who each other is, you know, we forget about party. We even forget about color. Imagine that. You know, so as I said, 10 a.m., second Saturday of the month, Bible Way Church. I'm hoping to see you there. And gentlemen, you did a fine job.
Thank you, sir.
I wasn't sure where you were going at first.
So again, we'll take about 5-minute break, so please help yourself to water. Please peruse the books in the back, bathroom break. And we're gonna invite Molly Shane up for a photograph with our guest.
229 just now, so should we do that first, and then we order afterwards?
We'll do the photo first? Yes, photo first. So please, if our guest would relax for about 5 minutes, we'll get the photo done. Come back in the room, and then you can engage with our nation builders. Yes.
Yeah, well, I thought I'd look at the book. I haven't seen the book. And,